A siege started suddenly. One day, things were normal. The next, they were not. You might be out in the fields working the land. You might be at the market selling your wares. Then the word came. A rider, out of breath. Enemy soldiers were nearby, many of them, too many. Panic spread like wildfire. People ran. They ran toward the city gates. Farmers left their tools in the dirt. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Everyone pushed and shoved. They wanted to get inside. The gates closed fast. You heard the big timbers slide into place. The heavy chains clanged shut. The city was locked. You were in or you were out. Being out meant certain death or capture. Your family might be split, one inside, one outside. This happened often. Inside, fear grew. No one really knew what would happen. Some old men remembered other sieges. They told grim stories, stories of hunger, disease, and the final bloody assault. Most people just felt a cold dread. The first thing was to check your own home. Did you have food? Not much. Most people lived day to day. They bought food fresh from market. Now markets were gone. Farmers couldn't bring in their produce. The flow of life stopped. The city leaders acted quickly. They took control of food stores. Big warehouses held grain. The Lord's castle had a deep well. These were vital. They started counting people. How many mouths to feed? How much food was there? The numbers never looked good. People brought what they had, a sack of flour, a smoked ham, some dried fish, a few jars of pickled vegetables. This was collected. It would be shared later. It was never enough for long, but it was a start. It showed a common effort. Water was also a worry. The wells were inside the walls. They were precious. Guards watched them day and night. No one could waste water. No one could foul it. A bad well meant death for everyone inside. It was simple. Then the enemy appeared. You saw them from the walls. A great camp sprang up. Tents covered the ground outside the city. Fires burned, sending smoke into the sky. You saw their banners. You saw their siege engines being built. Big wooden towers. Huge catapults. Battering rams covered with thick hides. Your stomach dropped. This was not a raid. This was a war of attrition. The first attacks were often probes. Riders would approach, shouting insults. They fired arrows at the battlements. They tested the guards' resolve. The city's archers fired back. Some people cheered. Some just stood silent, watching. The city walls were your only protection. They were tall, they were thick, but they had weak spots. Everyone knew where they were. The main gates were always a prime target. So were sections where the wall might be older, less strong. Soldiers got ready. They sharpened swords. They checked armor. They prepared their bows. Civilians also had jobs. Women helped collect stones, they heated water, they boiled oil. Children helped carry messages or water to the defenders. Everyone had to do something. You felt useful. It helped calm the fear a little. It was better than just waiting. But the nights were bad. You heard noises from the enemy camp, hammering, shouts. The creak of heavy timbers. They were building things. They were getting ready for a serious push. Sleep was hard to find. You lay awake listening. You thought about what tomorrow would bring. It rarely brought good news. The smell changed. More people were crammed together. Less space, less clean water, less good food. The smell of fear hung in the air too. It was a heavy, constant thing. You tried to ignore it. You couldn't. Life inside a besieged city was not like normal life. Everything changed overnight. Food was rationed right away. Water became more precious than gold. Every day was a fight, not just against the enemy outside, but against hunger, against thirst, against despair. The walls felt strong. They were built to protect, but you knew they could fall. Other cities had fallen. Everyone knew those stories too. They hoped this city would be different. They prayed for it. The city leaders tried to sound strong. They said help would come. A relief army sent by your king or your lord. Your banners would ride over the hill. You wanted to believe them. You had to believe them. Without hope, there was nothing. But hope faded with each passing day. The enemy just kept building. They just kept getting closer. The siege was a waiting game, a game of attrition. Who could last longer? The attackers outside with their endless supplies. Or the defenders inside, trapped and running low. You were part of that calculation. Your hunger, your thirst, your dwindling hope, everything mattered. Every single person. You watched the enemy camp. You looked for signs of weakness. You looked for signs of a retreat. There were none. Just more tents, more soldiers, more siege engines. The ring around the city grew tighter. You felt trapped, like an animal in a cage. But this cage had stone walls, and the hunters outside were very patient. This was your new reality, a dark, dangerous new reality. Daily life inside a besieged city quickly became a nightmare. The novelty of the first few days wore off. A harsh routine set in. It was all about survival. And food was the biggest worry. The initial stores ran out fast, then rationing started. Everyone got a small amount, a handful of grain, a scrap of dried meat, if you were lucky. Sometimes just bread. Stale, coarse bread. It was never enough. Your stomach constantly ached. The children cried from hunger. People got creative. They ate anything. Rats became a source of food. So did pigeons. Dogs and cats disappeared. People even ate shoe leather sometimes. The rich people suffered too. Their fine wines and fresh food ran out. They ate the same meager rations as everyone else. Sometimes they secretly had more, but not for long. Water was also a constant concern. The wells were guarded. You stood in long lines for your daily share. It was often muddy or tasted bad. A disease spread easily through bad water. People got sick, many died, sanitation was terrible. There was no good way to deal with waste. Trenches were dug, they filled up quickly. The smell was awful, it hung over everything. Flies were everywhere. This made disease worse. And dysentery was common. It weakened people fast, then other diseases took hold, the enemy never stopped. During the day, they launched attacks. Catapults threw huge stones. They hit houses. They broke walls. Trebuchets flung burning tar. Fire broke out. People rushed to put it out. Archers on the walls fired back. You heard the thud of arrows. You heard the screams. At night it was different. They tried to dig tunnels. Sappers worked under the ground. Soldiers would listen for their picks. If a tunnel was found, defenders would dig their own tunnel. They would try to collapse the enemies, or they would fill it with smoke or water. It's a dirty, desperate fight under the earth. Sleep was rare. The constant noise. The fear. The hunger. You would drift off, then a sudden crash would wake you. Or a shout. Or the distant rumble of a siege engine. You learned to sleep in short bursts. You were always tired. Morale was a fragile thing. The city leaders tried to keep spirits up. Priests held services. They prayed for deliverance. Sometimes the soldiers would make a successful sally. They would attack the enemy camp. They would burn some siege engines. These moments brought cheers. They brought a brief spark of hope, but the enemy always rebuilt. They always came back stronger. The children suffered greatly. They didn't understand why they were hungry, why their parents were so sad. They saw death often. They grew up too fast. The elderly were also vulnerable. They had less strength. They were often the first to succumb to hunger or illness. Their deaths were quiet. No one had the energy for proper mourning. The smell of death became common. Bodies were buried quickly. Sometimes, not properly. This also spread disease. The air was thick with smoke. From fires, from burning tar, from cooking what little food you had. You learned to recognize the sounds. The distinct thwack of a trebuchet launching a stone, the heavy boom when it landed. The whistle of arrows, the shouts of men. You lived in a constant state of alert. Your nerves were frayed. Life was a monotonous cycle. Wake up if you had slept. Go to your assigned duty. Haul stones. Carry water. Stand watch. Look for cracks in the wall. Repair damage. Wait in line for food. Eat the meager ration. Go to bed if you could. And repeat. There was no escape. The walls that protected you also trapped you. You watched birds fly freely over the enemy lines. You envied them. You saw the enemy soldiers eating. They had fires. They had plenty of food. You hated them. But you also envied their freedom. The outside world seemed a dream. Their green fields, fresh bread, clean water, simple things. Now they were luxuries beyond imagining. Your world shrank to the city walls. Every brick, every cobblestone, every suffering face. This was your new terrible world, and you wondered how long it could last. How long you could last. Hope came and went. Sometimes a messenger bird was caught. It carried a tiny scroll. A promise of aid, a date for relief. These moments were like a burst of sunlight. But if the date passed and no army came, the darkness was even deeper. You learned not to hope too much. It hurt less that way. The days blended into weeks, weeks into months. The calendar lost its meaning. There was only before the siege and now. The now felt like it would never end. It was a slow grinding torture. Every day brought new deaths. Every day brought more hunger. Every day brought the enemy closer, bit by bit. The walls were the city's shield. They were where the real fight happened. Soldiers were the main defenders. But civilians played a crucial role too. Everyone had to help. Archers stood on the battlements. They fired arrows down at the enemy. Crossbowmen took careful aim. Their bolts could pierce armor. Slingers threw stones. These could crack skulls. Every missile counted. Supplies of arrows dwindled. They had to be collected after enemy attacks. Sometimes children would gather them. Soldiers had to patrol. They watched for enemy movements. They checked for weak spots in the walls. They listened for digging. They knew the enemy would try to breach the defenses. Civilians did the heavy lifting. When a catapult stone hit the wall, it left a gap. Or it weakened the stone. People brought up more stones. They mixed mortar. They tried to repair the damage. It was dangerous work. Enemy archers aimed for anyone on the wall. One common defense was to drop things. Big stones were rolled down. They crushed enemy soldiers. Hot water was poured over the walls. It scalded attackers. Boiling oil was even worse. It burned flesh right off the bone. This was a messy, brutal business. Women and older children often helped with this. They heated the liquids. They hauled them up to the wall walk. The gates were a constant target. Battering rams would pound them. Hour after hour, the gate timbers would splinter. The iron bolts would groan. Defenders would try to reinforce the gates from inside. They would pile logs and dirt. They would shoot down at the ram operators. It was a fight for every inch. Sometimes the enemy built siege towers. These were huge wooden structures. They were rolled up to the wall. The soldiers inside would try to cross a drawbridge onto the battlements. This was a terrifying moment. Hand-to-hand combat would erupt. Swords clashed. Axes swung. It was a bloody, desperate fight. Defenders knew if the tower succeeded, the city might fall. They fought with all their strength. Sapping was a silent threat. Enemy miners would dig tunnels under the walls. They would shore them up with wood. Then they would set the wood on fire. The wall above would collapse. This created a breach. Defenders had to countermine. They dug their own tunnels. They tried to intercept the enemy. Sometimes, two mining teams would break through into each other's tunnels. A dark, claustrophobic fight would start underground. The psychology of defense was key. Fear was always present, but so was anger. Anger at the invaders. Anger at the suffering. This anger fueled the fight. Leaders tried to keep morale high. They gave rousing speeches. They promised rewards. They promised swift justice for cowards. But treachery was also a risk. Some people might give up hope. They might try to betray the city. They might open a gate. They might send a message to the enemy. Guards watched for this. Suspicion was everywhere. A wrong word could mean death. Sometimes a sally was ordered. A group of soldiers would rush out of a side gate. They would attack the enemy. They would try to destroy a siege engine. Or disrupt their work. These were dangerous missions. Many soldiers died. But a successful sally could buy the city more time. It could boost morale. It could show the enemy that the city still had fight left. The defenders learned to read the enemy when they moved their siege engines closer. When they started a fresh wave of attacks. When they just sat and waited. Waiting was often the worst. It meant they were trying to starve you out. Or they were building something bigger. Something more deadly. The siege engines outside were a constant threat. Trebuchets flung huge rocks. These could smash through roofs. They could bring down entire houses. They also launched dead animals. Or diseased bodies. This was to spread fear. And disease. It worked. Ballistas fired giant bolts. They could pierce through thick wood. They could kill several men at once. Each impact was a jolt. Each hit on the wall was a fresh worry. The defenders had to be tireless. They worked day and night. Repairing, fighting, watching. The city became one big defensive machine. Every person was a cog in it. If one part failed, the whole thing was at risk. The sun beat down, or the rain poured, or the snow fell. The conditions were always harsh, but the defense never stopped. You knew if the walls fell, it was over. There would be no mercy. So you kept fighting. You kept working. You kept hoping. It was all you had left. The taste of dust and blood became familiar. The screams of the dying, both friend and foe, became background noise. Your own life hung by a thread, but so did everyone else's. As the siege dragged on, new enemies rose. These were far worse than any battering ram. Disease and starvation became the biggest killers. Food ran out. Everything edible was gone. People ate leaves, they ate roots, they ate grass, they boiled leather, they ground bones into a sort of flour. It was disgusting. It barely kept you alive, but it prolonged the suffering. People became walking skeletons. Their eyes sank in. Their skin turned pale. They had no energy. Starvation made people desperate. They fought over scraps, they stole food, laws broke down, the strong took from the weak. There were stories of cannibalism. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone knew it could happen. Water became scarce. The wells dried up, or they became contaminated. People drank anything. Rainwater from puddles, dirty water from sewers. This spread disease rapidly. Dysentery was a plague. It ripped through the population. People lost control of their bowels. They became weak. They died quickly. There was no medicine, no way to stop it. Then came other sicknesses. Fever, coughs. The plague itself could appear. When it did, it killed almost everyone. Bodies piled up. There was no strength to bury them properly. They were just taken outside the walls, or thrown into pits. This made the stench worse. It attracted more rats. The rats also carried disease. It was a vicious cycle. Hope started to die. Messages for relief armies stopped coming. Or they arrived, promising help that never came. The outside world seemed to forget about you. You felt abandoned. Some people tried to escape. They tried to climb the walls at night. Most were caught. Some were shot by enemy archers. Some fell to their death. A few might have made it. No one knew for sure, but the thought was always there. A way out. Surrender became a topic. It was whispered at first, then openly discussed. What would happen if they surrendered? Sometimes the enemy was merciful. They would take the city. They would spare the people. But often, it was a bloodbath. Soldiers would loot. They would kill. They would enslave. The fate of a surrendered city was always uncertain. It depended entirely on the besiegers' will. The city leaders faced an impossible choice: fight to the last man and die, or surrender and gamble on mercy. Neither option was good. They often tried to negotiate. They would send an envoy, a priest, a noble. They would ask for terms. The enemy usually demanded unconditional surrender. The longer the siege, the worse the terms became. If you held out too long, the enemy might be angry. They might show no mercy at all. They might kill everyone. This was a terrible fear. The defenders grew weaker. Soldiers were too hungry to fight well. Their armor became rusty. Their weapons dull. They still stood on the walls. They still tried. But the spirit was gone. Only grim determination remained. You watched your family starve. You watched your friends die from disease. You felt your own strength fading. Each day was a victory, just to wake up, just to breathe. The enemy knew this. They saw the weakness. They could smell the despair. They didn't have to attack as often. They could just wait. Let hunger and sickness do their work. It was a cruel tactic. But it was effective. The city became a tomb. Houses were empty. Streets were quiet. The only sounds were the moans of the sick, the occasional crash of a catapult stone, the distant shouts of the enemy. Sometimes you saw a flag, a white flag. It would be raised from the main tower. This meant negotiations were starting, or it meant surrender. Everyone watched it. With dread, with a strange mix of relief, the suffering might finally end, one way or another. The memory of fresh food felt like a distant dream, a ghost of a past life. You couldn't imagine a full stomach. You couldn't imagine a day without fear. This was your existence now, the slow, agonizing grind towards an unknown end. You learned to block out the pain, to ignore the hunger pangs, to just exist. But deep down, a tiny spark of defiance remained. A refusal to give up. To cling to life no matter how miserable. It was a primal instinct. The will to survive. Even when all hope was gone, the smell of smoke and decay filled the air. The bodies, the waste, the burning wood. It was an assault on all senses. You grew numb to it. You had to. To feel everything was to go mad. So you just kept going, one painful step at a time. Waiting for the final decision, the final outcome. The siege ended one of two ways. Either a relief army came, or the city fell. Both had their own kind of horror. If a relief army arrived, it was like a miracle. You would hear trumpets, you would see their banners, they would clash with the besiegers. Often, the enemy would flee. The gates would open. Joy, tears, and exhaustion would overwhelm everyone. But even then, the immediate aftermath was hard. The city was devastated. Buildings were ruined. Food was gone. Disease was rampant. The relief army brought food and medicine, but it took time to recover. Many people died even after the siege ended. They were too weak. They couldn't fight off the sickness. The psychological toll was immense. People had seen terrible things. They had suffered greatly. Finding family was the first priority. Who was still alive? Who had died from hunger or disease? Who had been killed in the fighting? The reunions were bittersweet, joy mixed with grief. Many found only empty homes, or empty spaces where loved ones used to be. Rebuilding started slowly. The walls had to be fixed. Houses needed repair. Fields outside the city had to be replanted. It took years. The city would never be the same. The scars were deep on the land and on the people. But what if the city fell? This was often worse. If the city was breached or surrendered after a long, bitter fight, the enemy might take revenge. Soldiers would pour in, they would loot everything, they would burn houses, they would kill the men. They would rape the women. It was a time of brutal violence. No one was safe. Sometimes the enemy lord would take pity. He might spare the general population, but often he would sell them into slavery. Or he would demand a huge ransom. Life under new rule was harsh. You lost your home. You lost your freedom. You lost everything. If you survived the fall, you would carry the memory forever. The screams, the fires, the blood. You would try to forget, but it would be impossible. Even if you were spared, the city would be ruined. The conquerors would take everything of value. They would leave you with nothing. You would have to start from scratch, under the thumb of a new hated lord. The long-term trauma of a siege was immense. People changed, they became wary, they were always looking over their shoulder. They might hoard food. Even when there was plenty, they might distrust strangers. They might suffer from nightmares. The sounds of war would haunt them. Children who survived grew up with these memories. They carried the scars of starvation and fear. They understood the fragility of life. They saw the worst of humanity, and sometimes the best. People helping each other, sharing what little they had, fighting side by side. A siege was a test of endurance, a test of faith, a test of humanity. Some failed it. Others found an inner strength they never knew they had. They learned the true value of simple things: a full meal, clean water, a safe bed, the peace of a quiet day. Life after a siege was a new chapter. It was never truly normal again. The world had shown its ugly face. You had seen it up close, you had survived it. But the experience changed you. It made you older, wiser, and sometimes colder. You learned that survival was not just about strength. It was about resilience, about adapting, about holding onto a tiny spark of hope, even when there was none left. It was about community, working together, sharing the burden. The physical wounds might heal, but the mental ones stayed. They shaped who you became. You might carry a limp, or a cough, or a haunted look in your eyes. These were the marks of a survivor. You had faced death, and you had won. For now. The world outside the city walls slowly came back into focus. The sun still rose. The grass still grew. But your perception was different. Everything felt sharper, more precious. You knew what it meant to live, and you knew how quickly it could all be taken away. This was the lasting legacy of a medieval siege, a harsh, brutal lesson etched into your very soul.